Welcome to the panel. I'm Terry Seguin, and today I am in the studio with Liberal Party leader Susan Holt, Green Party leader David Coon, and here for the Progressive Conservative government, Dominic Cardy. And welcome to you all. Thank you very much for being here, and thanks for giving us your valuable time today. Much appreciated. Now, our topic today for our first panel is a pretty broad one, to be honest. It's the current state of the province, and that topic, I know, covers a lot of different issues. And we're going to get that conversation started in just a moment. But first, I would like to thank Rogers TV for providing the platform for us to have this discussion today. I'm grateful Rogers recognizes the value in having elected representatives, your elected representatives, discuss and debate the issues affecting this province, the issues affecting you. And I would also like to thank my former CBC colleagues for everything they have taught me about broadcasting. And now on to today's subject. Okay, the current state of New Brunswick. Susan Holt, you're in the airport, you run into an old friend and they say, Susan, how are things in New Brunswick?
Well, I would say I'm hearing from New Brunswickers more anxiety than I think I've ever heard before. There's a lot of different things that are really concerning people, and the first one, and we could probably use this entire time to talk about it, is our healthcare system. Right? People are really deeply concerned. They either don't have access to primary care, right? They're on the waiting list for a doctor, or maybe they even have one, but the ability to get in to see them, to get into an after-hours clinic, is finding their way. They're finding their way to the emergency room, but that concerns them too, because we've had emergency room closures all over the province. We heard yesterday that there was an ambulance waiting 41 hours to offload at the Moncton Hospital. So people are worried that I'm going to get sick, and maybe there isn't an ER to go to, and maybe I'm going to be sitting in an ambulance. And the crisis in healthcare, I think, is creating a deep level of anxiety for New Brunswickers. And then you could add to that the increasing pressure of the cost of living, the fact that people's rents are going up, the price of groceries is going up, they're paying more for everything at a time when wages are stagnant. You add to that a housing crisis. You know, people are finding that finding housing is extremely difficult. So the housing that is there is extremely expensive, and there's a climate crisis. I could go on,
So when people,
but maybe and that encapsulates a mental health crisis, right? People are anxious, frustrated, scared. So it's a tough time in New Brunswick right now.
So when you're meeting people and they're telling you this, what do you say to them?
I feel it, right? Like we experience the same challenges at home. That life is getting more expensive for us and for our kids, and it needs a different approach, right? We've built these systems, housing systems, healthcare systems, over a century, and society has changed significantly in the last, I think you said 5 years just a moment ago, in the recent history. So our solutions to these problems have to be different than the approaches that created them, which means we all have to be ready for some change, and we have to be embarking on that change immediately, right? Like in a way that includes New Brunswickers in the conversation and in the solution development.
Okay, we're going to talk about that change a little bit later on. David Coon, I want to ask you the same question. Okay, what is your assessment of the state of New Brunswick?
Well, we've got some big problems. People are not feeling well served in a number of areas. I mean, on health care, access, we know, as Susan said, is a big problem. The capacity of the system to address the needs of people when they can access the healthcare system is flooded. We've got nurses who are trying to hold everything together at the expense of their own health and well-being on floors and in the ER and on wards in numbers that are way too few to manage the work that they've got before them. So we've got huge problems there. On housing. I was talking to some child protection social workers in Charlotte County recently who said they now are having difficulty reuniting families who are supposed to be reunited with their kids because there isn't the housing to accommodate them. The mayor of Sheboygan was telling me how they are having trouble housing students, and therefore enabling students to come to either the University of Moncton campus or the community college there. We've got people who are being evicted from their homes who can't find housing, And I was in Capilé the other day, and the mayor was telling me how they can't house workers who are working in the fish plants and the other businesses in Capilé. So they're actually, the businesses are investing in buses to bus people from Moncton, where there is, I guess, some accommodations, into Capilé for work. So now you have businesses talking about creating their own accommodations, like in the olden days, when Connors Brothers and Black's Harbor had their own homes, or up in Marysville when the cotton mill had the company homes. So it's a huge issue, and of course on climate change, clearly we're not ready. Looking at what happened as a result of Fiona, we're not prepared, particularly in terms of protecting our coastal communities and residents who live along our coastline. We've got 5,500 kilometers of coastline in New Brunswick, and the climate plan that was just released mentions nothing about storm surges, coastal flooding, coastal protection at all. So that's a curious thing in the face of the kind of threats that we are now not only are facing, but the consequences of the climate crisis we're experiencing.
Okay, well, it sounds like we've got some issues in New Brunswick. What's your assessment of the state of the province?
There are things I totally agree with that both Susan and David have said around the challenges in our healthcare system. Those aren't unique to New Brunswick. Everyone, I think, is aware of that this is a national, international, really across North America, and really a global problem with rich economies, a consequence of, I think, as Susan mentioned, the fact that we've had a radical change in the way our societies are organized around the West and the democracies the last few years, and that's hit New Brunswick more than a lot of places.
Why?
Well, in some ways, because we've actually gotten through to this stage better than some spots. We just got a statistic this morning. We have the highest rate of population growth last year on year, since Confederation. 3 of the 10 cities, Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John, growing faster than nearly anywhere else in Canada. We've got some of the highest levels of employment. We've had some serious wage increases. This has pushed us into having to deal with a whole list of problems that we haven't had to deal with before, or for a long time. Problems around growth, the issues around housing. That for a long time, successive governments ignored housing as an issue because we had a surfeit of housing stock and we had people leaving, and it wasn't the priority. I would argue it should still have been dealt with more effectively than it was, because we were letting people fall through the cracks. But regardless, today, we're seeing people who have got 2 families with steady incomes who are having trouble finding a place to live. So dealing with the housing issue, I think, for me, is one of the most fundamental issues, because unless we can get our population up, we're not going to have the ability to continue to support all the programs that we currently have, because of the change in our population and demographics. So the folks who are here right now are getting older. It's fantastic we're seeing this population increase. We've got to continue to attract families and young professionals, and I would argue people from nearly every background, to move to the province, to bump up our population. And we see, in terms of a good thing, in New Brunswick right now, a level of a spirit of welcoming and openness from people across the province that I think 15-year-old me, if I'd wandered around New Brunswick in the mid-'80s, I would have been happily surprised at that change. There are people up in little fishing communities and mining towns who are saying, like, we need people here, just get us folks. Nothing about where do people come from. Everyone's like, we'll set up language programs for people in schools. So there are some really good things going on in terms of the province overall. Our debt levels rates are down to an incredibly low level, far below what we'd originally hoped we'd achieve in the first couple of years in government. That's giving us the ability, with surpluses, to be able to reinvest money in programs that matter, rather than sending that money to New York banks, which to me is a good thing.
Just on that point about the economy, the Toronto Dominion Bank did a provincial economic forecast, and it's saying a marked slowdown in activity remains in the cards. It has merely been delayed until late this year and into 2023. New Brunswick has a higher than average exposure to the deteriorating global outlook. I mean, what is our plan to deal with that?
First plan was to make sure we got our fiscal house in order, which we've done. So we're going to have money to be able to invest on projects that will help us get to that downturn, because that clearly is coming. You hear some of the folks from the European Central Bank and some of the other international agencies the last week saying the chances of a recession next year are increasing all the time. So that's the reality. New Brunswick's a small province. We're not going to be able to change the international economic situation. So what can we do to make sure that we're well prepared? We can make sure we've got competitive taxes so we can attract people, housing so we can attract people, education and healthcare systems that work. the only way we're going to get.
Geez,
So-
healthcare system isn't working, is it?
But that's it. But the way it's going to work is, we're dealing here with a finite pool of people around the world who've got the ability to work in hospitals. And that's largely what we're talking about, doctors and nurses. So first off, we have a problem with foreign credential recognition. And that's something where we have got to, and I know that the government I'm part of has been pleading and working with the professional association, saying we need to allow people who want to come to New Brunswick to be able to practice. We've had doctors who were doing surgeries, in some cases have surgeries named after them, working right now as orderlies in New Brunswick hospitals.
Let me
That
ask you
doesn't
this.
make sense.
Do you have faith in the people who are running our healthcare system now?
I think there are an incredibly large number of people working in our healthcare system. I think they are working incredibly hard, but it comes
the
back
people
to
who are running it, not the people who are working in it, people who are the administrators. I mean, we had someone die in an emergency room.
Yeah.
We all know the story about the young woman who went in because of a sexual assault. I mean, those are colossal failures of the system. So do you have faith in the people who are actually making sure the system runs the way it's supposed to?
Well, after the first incident we talked about, the death, there was a complete change in the leadership in the Department of Health and a lot of very radical changes undertaken there. And I'm hoping that we'll see fruit in the coming months. But it's not just going to be a leadership change. It's going to ultimately require a change in the way that we run our entire healthcare system. Because right now, we continue, as Susan put it really well, after the Second World War, we built a welfare state based on guy goes to work, woman stays home and raises the family. And we added on a lot of social programs that have changed the world and made life better for just about everyone. But we have never properly updated that system to recognize that first off, most families, both parents work, and it doesn't matter what gender they are. We haven't taken into account that people are working, because they're now working 9 to 5, having government services that are offered 9 to 5, and accessible after hours, including in many cases healthcare. It's a system across the Western world, all the social democracies, that just doesn't match the life that we live in. So we've got to look at radical changes, and I would argue conversations like this, where we can get parties talking together about things that we could actually do to build that system, that's going to be a lot better, because the other big risk we're facing right now, we're talking about changing these huge complex structures. Meanwhile, we've got forces of increasingly violent populism trying to stop us from actually having conversations at all about anything other, whether we should go and hide in the far right corner or the far left corner.
Okay, Susan Holt, how much faith do you have that the people who are running the healthcare system can fix what's wrong?
I mean, right now, I have to say I don't have much faith, partly because I don't know who they are anymore, right? We've eliminated the boards that had elected officials on them. It seems like what I'm hearing is all decisions are getting rolled into the Premier's office to be decided there. So I'm not sure that
What's the problem with that?
Well, the Premier's not an expert in healthcare, and one person can't do everything, right? We are a province of, hopefully approaching 1 million people soon, and having one person trying to run the healthcare system and the tax system and the housing system, and it's not efficient, it's not realistic, and it doesn't empower people to drive the changes. So I would disagree with what Dominic said about the number one thing being foreign credential recognition. We have a culture problem where the staff delivering on the ground level in the healthcare system are not being respected. And we saw that with the example you gave of the woman who sort of bravely flagged an issue with how she was treated when she came in for sexual assault, only to then hear the government throw the nurse that supported her under the bus. And you think, okay, well, I would probably quit my job if I was her. And that lack of respect that I've heard permeates, across the system is something we need to address to stop the exodus of people from the system. We need to retain the talent that we have as we then leverage programs like credential recognition and recruitment to try and increase our numbers of healthcare providers. But it's pretty hard to have faith in the management of it when we don't hear what's going on. There's no transparency, there's no communication, there's no measurement being reported, or if there is measurement, you're getting numbers from Vitalite and Horizon and different numbers from government. So it's pretty hard to have faith that things are being well run right now.
David Coon?
Well, here's the thing. Doctors and nurses have been telling me that for 10 years, they have been pushing forward ideas to solve some of the big issues that we're were percolating in the healthcare system, or that were very present in the healthcare system, and those proposals bounce back at them all the time from management. So the sense of urgency that the doctors and nurses on the ground were feeling in the challenges of treating their patients and providing good, timely access to patients was not felt at the management level, and they were not listening. So there's clearly some problem there. Look at Dr. Yogi Segal, the recommendations he's made. These are not the first time those kinds of recommendations have been made, but there's been no great response to that. This has been the routine for a long time now. Doctors and nurses are extremely frustrated with the inability to be heard, with the lack of sense of urgency. It was, I think, 3 years ago that all of the ER doctors wrote an open letter to say, we have a crisis here. People are going to die, and now they have. And yet nothing changed, nothing happened. So it's been unresponsive. Certainly no sense of urgency that the doctors and nurses have been feeling.
So how do you fix that? If management is getting in the way, what do you do?
So in terms of parties working together, one of the things, and I agree with Dominic on this, one of the things I proposed to the Premier a couple of years ago was we need to make sure that the parties are together on this. Let's have an all-party committee, open up, bring in the doctors publicly, bring in the doctors, bring in the nurses, bring in the patients, bring in the health managers, and hear what the issues are, hear what their solutions are, so that all the MLAs are exposed to that and the public's exposed to that, which will make it easier to do the kind of restructuring reforms that are absolutely needed, the magnitude of those things
So
are
this is
needed. And the Premier said, no. Unfortunately, healthcare has been used politically as a wedge issue historically. And that's been one of the reasons I think we haven't progressed very far. Well, you mean anytime whatever government has suggested they're going to do one thing or another, then it's been turned into a big political issue.
Like hospital closures.
Well, whatever it is, rather than, so we need to, the point was to get past all of that, to bring the parties together in an all-party committee, to do this publicly, hear from the doctors and nurses, hear from everyone, patients, and that would help build awareness publicly. It would make sure all the MLAs are on the same page from all of the parties, and enable us then to debate the solutions and hopefully move things forward with public support and support from all the parties. That may seem a little Pollyannish, but that is, I think, the way we needed to go. When we were in the minority government, there was collaboration going on, and we were getting some useful and helpful things done for New Brunswickers at that time.
But what are we going to hear in an all-party committee setting about the healthcare system that we don't already know?
Well, now it's probably, we're well beyond that, I guess. But this was, this was back in 2018 or so that I proposed this to the Premier. I think it's almost too late for that process at this point. I'm getting now, on top of the emails from doctors and nurses and patients about the horror stories, both in terms of their working conditions and what patients are facing. I had a person whose dad with dementia and pneumonia was in the hallway in an ER for 6 days recently. It's really problematic. But this is absolutely something that's got to be addressed in a meaningful way now. And I still believe that the opportunity is there for parties to come together around this in good faith. It has to be done through the legislature, though. But the thing with the Premier is he wanted to try and do this at the level of the leaders behind closed doors, like the COVID committee. And the COVID cabinet committee made sense when we were in kind of the crisis of COVID.
Right.
And it did a lot of good, and it helped, I think, address the fears that people had. But now, the fears that what I'm getting in the emails are fear from people saying, I don't know what's going to happen when I go to the ER. I don't know what I'm going to do because I can't access health care, on top of the horror stories that have been flowing in by email.
Dominic Cardy, when that gentleman died in the emergency room at the Chalmers, there was supposed to be an analysis, an investigation into what happened. Whatever happened to that? Do we even know at this point what happened? Have there been any repercussions? I mean, other than the change you referred to earlier, but do we know now?
So I haven't heard the final, because I know that that was a request and that would eventually come back into cabinet, but it hasn't yet, which doesn't hugely surprise me that things, especially HR issues, take some time. But in terms of the changes, I mean, pick up 2 points. First, one of the things that Susan said in reference to the horrible story of the woman who was turned away when she asked for the rape kit. That yes, there was a totally insensitive communication that came out, but Susan said that's from the government. It wasn't actually from the health department, though. It's from the folks who are running the hospitals. And part of the problem we have is that there is and I'm running into this in the education system as well. So I compare the two for a sec. Health authorities and districts have massive legal authority that operates nearly without democratic oversight. And that's in part because of pressure in previous decades to say that we want to try and get politicians out of controlling those processes, which is something that generally I'm really supportive of. But if you push that to the point that there really isn't any oversight, you end up by having bureaucracies that take on a life of their own and are able to just
Is that what we're
on
dealing with here in New Brunswick now? Bureaucracies that have taken on a life of their own?
In many cases, and that's not a criticism of the civil servants involved either, because it's just the culture that we've set up, that we have legislatures that sit and we chat and we say things about whatever, and laws are passed, but then in the end, the machinery just carries on.
Do we know what the ratio of administrators to actual frontline healthcare workers is?
I'm sure that the minister would, and lots of people in his staff, but as education minister, I can get you lots of details about my department, but I don't have those at the top of my head, but I can find them for you. But it's not necessarily a problem of disequilibrium between workers and managers. It's about what are we trying to get the system to do? Because sort of building then on what David was saying about how we can work together on things. If we accept that the healthcare system starts off with the people, right? Unless we have qualified professionals with credentials, because that's how we recognize someone's qualified to work in healthcare. So we got X number of those people. And yes, we've got a pathway to attract X plus and go and find some more people. That takes time and is incredibly difficult. And if every party acknowledged that it was incredibly difficult, I think that would improve the quality of politics and would have when the Liberal government was in power last time.
Well, no one said it isn't. It's easy.
If you listen to the legislature, it's often a quick thing that all parties do in opposition is to say that, well, why aren't you hiring more people? And we should have just hired more people when we'd had the chance. There have not been more people easily available to hire in healthcare for a long time.
Do we even have a physician recruiter?
But worse than that, what happens is if someone's considering a job here, say a physician moving to New Brunswick, they call their colleagues up and ask them, what's the situation like? And what right? And most of our physicians are going to say, we got some issues here you need to know about before making your decision. So it is difficult to recruit. There's no question about it. But you also, if you've got it,
But if I can finish my argument, though.
Right, but if you've got a difficult environment, it's difficult to recruit into
that. It is. But if we can start off by saying X number is required, one of the problems that we're having is that we're continuing to have a population. We saw this with the reaction to the health reforms before in 2020, which nearly precipitated an election when we had a minority. That we talked about restrictions on operating hours in a small number of hospitals, and there was a backlash against that.
But it was more than that. That was replacing acute beds.
But the backlash around emergency rooms. Sorry, but the background around emergency rooms, though, the problem there ended up by having to be reimposed accidentally rather than in a planned way because we knew that we had a problem with staffing. And yes, that's something we have to continue to work even harder to work on. And as opposition parties, you should absolutely hold the government's feet to the fire for not meeting any targets and pushing for higher targets. But at the same time, some of that conversation around healthcare in the early 2020 was not connected to reality because there was a lot of people pushing a narrative saying that we have a system that no longer exists and therefore it should continue to do the things the system can't do anymore.
But
okay, Susan, go ahead.
I mean, I appreciate what Dominic's trying to say, and I don't think anyone's suggesting it's easy, but the recruitment system is broken. Right? I have heard stories from people who want to come and practice here and who have applied to come and practice here and who aren't getting responded to, not getting called back. I know nurses who are working as casuals who want full-time jobs, who want to be permanent and are not getting those opportunities because the system is not responding to them and isn't resourced to and it isn't prioritized or measured on that work. And so it's really frustrating to hear from somebody who wants to come in New Brunswick. They want to practice in Sussex. There's a job available that's perfect for them. They applied for it in November. It's April. They haven't heard back. So I don't want to suggest that recruitment is easy, but I certainly don't think that we've been doing a good job at it for a number of years. And it needs resources, it needs priority, it needs alignment, and I don't think that an appropriate focus has been put there, judging from all the stories of nurses and healthcare professionals and doctors that would like to be working here and that haven't been given the opportunity to.
Do we even have a recruiter, like a top recruiter in the province now?
Well, if we had those folks, they'd be working for the two health authorities who operate separate.
Well, the Department of Health has a position. They were recently recruiting for it. It was empty.
And
They couldn't find someone to do it.
But it gets again back to part of the problems. We've got two issues. First is we need just recruiting of people in general. The next thing is, why are we having these problems with folks who are already in the province or want to come here? And that's the reason behind some of the big changes at Health, was to get us answers to those questions.
Isn't it
because those are
money?
being frustrating.
Because I have had conversations with people who have just entered the system. And for them, it's a matter of, I don't feel that I'm getting respect. I'm not getting the money. Not getting paid what I think I should be paid for what I'm doing. So, I mean, if you think you're going to come to New Brunswick and you're going to be nickeled and dimed and you're not going to get the money you think you deserve, why would you come here?
I'll use an example there that I'm really familiar with in the school side, dealing with medical professionals, with school psychologists, that we went and renegotiated our contract with the school psychologist, got them a significant increase in salary because they had absolutely been underpaid, and even in regional terms. We still aren't seeing any significant new numbers because there aren't that many of them. And the ones who do have those high-level qualifications, it's difficult when you're dealing with, in Canada on healthcare, a single-payer system with serious cost controls, and we're living next to the United States, who recognizes all of our credentials.
Well, one of the things that was happening here up until recently was, for Horizon anyways, they were not offering new nursing graduates full-time permanent jobs.
Right.
But they were in PEI, and they were in Nova Scotia, and they were in Quebec, and on top of that, they were getting a signing bonus for going there. So, you know, that's not competitive. You're not being, the government or the province isn't being competitive in those cases with those other jurisdictions.
Why aren't we doing that?
So some of the, again, without getting into the specifics of another minister's file, but I know
And this was across different governments. I'm not talking about a single government in this case.
But again, these problems are all systemic, right? Because
Right.
we've built this system up across Canada, and other provinces are having
systemic
kind of the
problems,
same
no question
issues as
about
we are. But the reason why I think some of that stuff hasn't happened is because we have had a disconnection between the politics and the administration and healthcare for a long time, for, again, good reasons to start with, but it had been allowed to build and build so that politicians could say, we're letting the healthcare system manage itself. But in the end, every country, no matter how bad, has a government of some sort. And bureaucracies are always part of any government, no matter how good or bad. The difference in our system is that we've got people who are elected, who are accountable to the public, to sit on top of that system and take the heat for when things go wrong, and also try and drive the ideas the public send back into the system. In education and health in New Brunswick, for a long time, that has been very, very difficult. For some very good reasons, again, because you don't want to undermine the credibility of doctors and experts and the people who've gone to school for a long, long time to get their professional credentials.
But Susan
You've
raises
gotta-
a good point.
Well, you've got to listen to them, right? Like when we're hearing from nurses and doctors that they're offering suggestions and they're not being listened to, they're not being invited into the conversation, then you think, so that would be the role of the elected arm, is to get that expert advice from a variety of sources and to communicate it openly and transparently
how would that work with the
to
health
New
authorities?
Brunswickers. Well, there's lots of organizations like the Nurses Union and others that are sharing information regularly with government and with the health authorities. So we can create good collaborative partnerships between the different arms of the system, recognizing they each have their own interests. But it's government's job to be looking after the best interests of New Brunswickers and listening to those voices and finding common ground solutions.
So what
not
does the
turning them
solution-
away and telling them that we're not interested in their opinion because we think we know best without consulting the experts.
So what does the solution look like then?
Well, I think it looks like just that. You have open and transparent conversations with the experts that are in the system who are readily offering solutions on the ground, and you work in partnership with the people who need to manage the system with those expert voices to advance the changes, like multidisciplinary care teams that want to work after hours at community level, trying to provide primary care and giving them the technology they need to do that because they have asked for that time and time again, giving them the respect that you pointed out. There's a feeling of respect that is really missing in the system, which is impacting our ability to serve New Brunswickers. And if that respect isn't shown from the top down, then we're not going to improve the system.
Okay.
The immediate need, though, is to urgently retain nurses who are leaving the bedside in droves because of the working conditions they're in. So this is creating this downward spiral right now, which is leading to, a doctor recently emailed me and said it's like a war zone inside the hospitals. So this is this is a crisis.
Explain that. What do you mean?
Well, because they're so short-staffed, and many more and more of the nurses they have are young nurses who haven't had mentors, and they're great, but they're new, and so they're working short-handed and with new nurses. So it's a very difficult situation. So we need to put in place measures to retain our nurses. One of the things that would help right off the bat, especially for the ER nurses and physicians, is if Horizon had the funds and the direction to put up urgent care centers to take people out of the ER who can't get to their family doctors or don't have them, to get access to the healthcare system, get primary health care. So they're not sitting in the ER, so they're not requiring nurses and doctors in the ER to do family medicine. They're ER experts. They do emergency medicine, but a lot of their time is doing family medicine. We need to create something new, an urgent care clinic, a primary care clinic in our cities to handle those people who are still waiting to get family doctors or nurse practitioners.
Well, and I'll just caution, that's not new, right? When I was at the Chamber in 2010, we were advocating for collaborative care clinics. When I was a candidate in 2018, we were proposing urgent care centers. Our party just put out 6 ideas on health, and the first one was multidisciplinary team-based care clinics to take the pressure off the ERs, because people are going there because 811 is telling them to, because they can't get an after-hours clinic, they don't have a family doctor.
Right.
So these, to the point David made a lot earlier, these are ideas that have been around for a long time and that governments haven't acted on. And now is a time, Dominic pointed out, they have a surplus, they have money they could be investing in the well-being of New Brunswickers to set up these kinds of structures that would take the pressure off ERs and serve New Brunswickers well. And we're all waiting, wondering, why haven't they acted?
Dominic Cardy, do New Brunswickers have the right to expect their government to implement measures that Susan and David are talking about that will restore the faith they should have in the healthcare system?
Well, things like clinics, absolutely, and that's one of the things that we've been pushing. I know that was one of the things that led to some of those changes, is because this is an obvious solution that everyone has talked about for, it's been 20 or so years, I think, since this became an obvious solution to the looming, now on us, crisis of baby boomers retiring from the system. And also provides better care, and there's also lots of other good arguments for it as well. So absolutely, and we have moved ahead with getting some opened up. We still run into the problem where we still need people to staff those centers. That comes back again to right now we have a healthcare system where the decisions are largely being made outside of the hands of the Department of Health, who is essentially the check writer and enforcer of standards, basically, and the actual management, HR, and everything else has been delegated. So I am a no fan of centralized government, but at the same time, we've got to create something where there are links of democratic accountability to some of those structures, so they can operate on their own without having to listen to some of the experts. Because I've been in those rooms with the Premier, with medical experts talking about these things. And I have also been in the room with a doctor who told me, when I said, why aren't we able to get doctors who are working in this province who come here from France, who have got French medical credentials. France is generally considered to have the best public healthcare system in the world. And he said, because we cannot afford to let the standard of care for New Brunswickers be negatively impacted. I said, are you serious? A doctor from France is going to negatively impact our healthcare. Yes, the standards cannot be too high. I thought, and fortunately we were interrupted by an MC at an event before I could carry on with this, but the last thing I said to him was like, okay, so the standards of care are so high from the perspective of the doctors that New Brunswickers can't actually access it. So
That doesn't seem right.
So I'm going to push back on something. We've got to talk about how we recognize credentials. We've got to talk about which professionals are able to do which jobs in medicine. One of the things I'm proudest of the government I'm part of has done is to really expand the role of pharmacists, to let them take on their full scope of practice and let them use the training they received to be able to diagnose UTIs, for example, handle a lot of more routine care issues that they're trained to do. There are nurses who can do more, LPNs who can do more, which gets back to the respect and the value in a realigned medical system. But we have a medical system. It was built in the 1940s to 60s, but it was based on ideas from the 1890s where everything was dependent on a doctor. And that's not fair on the doctors either, because that's also based on doctors who would work how many hundreds of hours a week and do house calls at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that they performed a role that no longer exists, but we still pretend that it does and still expect that of them.
Right, but when Horizon, as I know they did, proposed to open more collaborative team-based clinics, health centers around the province, because Horizon owns a lot of real estate, they own a lot of buildings, they've got the places to put these things, they couldn't get the budget from the province to do it.
Yeah.
So in that case, the Premier and the Minister of Finance said no.
Wow.
No to a concrete
a bit
proposal to
rich.
do just what we're talking about.
It's a bit rich to hear you talk about no fan of centralization in the context of health when that is what has happened. It has become more and more centralized into smaller and smaller places rather than empowering and enabling the people closest to the patient to make the decisions in the best interest of the patient and have government learn to hold accountable those organizations and to measure them and their performance rather than removing all of that away and pulling it up to a level that's so out of touch with the patient that we're getting worse results.
Good point.
Well, but
So the
what I
question
hear, though,
Dominic Cardy
Dominic-
just asked is, how would that work?
No, he said, how did that work?
Right, because
how-
my point was that we have had a system which was expert-driven and largely independent from direct government oversight. And Susan, you had time in government and saw how that worked as well. So, if I just finish, the problem with, when I said I'm no fan of centralization, we need to have something that changes a system, but then it has to come back to something that's responsive at a community level. What we have had for years and years, again, is a system that operated largely away from political oversight, with the public perception being the only way to make healthcare better was to put more and more money in it. That's a lesson that was shown wrong with the largest ever single investment in healthcare in history. In the UK, I think it was 2001 or 2, the Blair government put billions of dollars into healthcare, and they got a short-term increase, and then it just disappeared again because the system hadn't changed. And it wasn't until they started to look at how do we actually change the way that the system works, people's expectations of it, the way the services are delivered. This is an enormous change that is bigger than anything that we've talked about since the war.
But if they don't have the money to change the system, how does the system
But
change?
we do have the money.
Well,
The money has been flowing in at a rate that's some of the largest increases ever in healthcare spending have happened in the last couple of years.
But is it sufficient? I mean, if we have people dying in an emergency, a person dying in an emergency room,
And we're still spending less than every other province in Atlantic Canada per New Brunswicker. Our levels of investment in healthcare are the lowest in this region by a significant amount in some cases. I think we're at $4,900 a head in New Brunswick, and they're at $7,000 a head in Newfoundland. It's a big difference, and I don't think our results are any better for it. I think that the health of our population and our access to care and the turnaround of that care within 48 hours is the worst in the country.
let me just ask this, because I just want to nudge the topic a little bit in a different direction. The Premier has said all options are on the table in terms of finding solutions, and some people have interpreted that as meaning privatization is an option. I just want to find out from the three of you how you feel about privatization playing a larger role in the delivery of healthcare services in New Brunswick. Susan Holt.
I mean, I think it's a slippery slope. I think there's also some confusion in how we operate today because many of our primary healthcare providers are private enterprises. They're billing the government as an entity. But some of that is actually what they're asking us to change. So when they want these team-based multidisciplinary clinics that have a multitude of professionals, and I'll give credit here where it's due. I think the expansion of services to the pharmacists has been a good thing. It's happened over a number of years, and it's good progress that we need to see replicated with midwives, with physiotherapists, with nurse practitioners, and with a number of other professionals that could be contributing more to this team-based collaborative community care environment. But that environment, to be connected in to the information that New Brunswickers need about their own health, and I don't want to have to pay $400 to go and buy my own health records from some private company because there's been a change in care provider, needs to have the public infrastructure that supports a single payer model. So we can get into the weeds on this, but I think ultimately we need to protect a single payer system to make sure that we have equitable access to healthcare for every New Brunswicker, no matter their wealth.
Okay, David Coon.
I actually think more physicians should be on payroll. And less in the current model. More physicians working in payroll and multidisciplinary teams in health centers and clinics would make a significant difference. The problems in our health system are not because of a lack of a profit motive to drive health care. That's not really that's not the problem. We have multiple problems, And many good solutions have been offered, but very few of them have been implemented. Some of it's going to take money. If new urgent care clinics or primary care clinics are set up to help people who haven't got a physician or haven't got a nurse practitioner or can't access them, that's going to cost some money. Put the doctors on payroll on those in those working in those clinics.
How would the doctors feel about that?
Well, I think it depends on the doctor. Many doctors like that, and some won't. And this is one of the reasons, I think, we haven't talked about this, but I think there is resistance from the medical community at some level to restructuring the way they do their job. And so that's something...
Dominic Cardy is acknowledging the truth of that.
Well, it's true, and so that's something we need to talk about. And governments have to be ready to stand up and have that discussion.
Wow, government versus doctors, that's not going to end well.
That's how we got Medicare.
Well, yeah, in the beginning.
People forget, in the beginning, there was a huge fight with the medical community over adopting Medicare, right? So that was, the history is amazing. When you look at it again, you say, I can't believe physicians were acting and behaving that way when the aim was to bring in Medicare so everyone could access health care without having to have a cost barrier.
But we can't rely on doctors voluntarily to do that, can we?
I don't think it needs to be a huge fight, right? It takes leadership and relationships. But what we're hearing from the medical society and from the nurses union and others is that they want this change to team-based models and multidisciplinary models. We're seeing it in the behavior of healthcare professionals as they move from family practice into ER and hospitals and other roles. So we're seeing these shifts happen. And if we're waiting for the last person to be on board, then maybe that's why it's taking us so long. But I think that the medical community has really moved a long way in the last, certainly in the last 3 years, and arguably in the last decade on this. And so I also think we should be able to be flexible. We've tried, in my mind, for far too long to do one-size-fits-all policy-based government, and it becomes one-size-fits-no-one. So why we can't accommodate a doctor who wants to continue to practice in the model they always have with their 5,000 patients at the same time as accommodating a new doctor that wants to practice differently in a different pay environment and in a different team environment, we should be able to do that. We're a small province. We could be nimble and creative if we had leadership and collaboration on the issues.
Well, there's a generational change driving that. So the newer generation of doctors is looking for that kind of environment to work in. And the older generation of doctors are used to the fee-for-service and having large numbers of patients, and that's how they work.
And we have both of those working in the system now.
So we do. There is already a mix, but the balance, I think, could move towards more on payroll.
I guess the question becomes, how long should we expect New Brunswickers to wait for the system that they have faith in? Doctors are retiring on a weekly, monthly basis, and some of them have hundreds of patients who are going to find themselves on the waiting list for a doctor in New Brunswick. What is a reasonable expectation for how long people should wait for the solution?
The problem is that there is no single solution, right? And this is going to be a multi-year process. I'm not going to make any bones about that. There's absolutely no way that these problems can be solved overnight because they are systemic. And I didn't want to let myself get away with not answering your question about privatization, but generally agree with what Susan said, that we have a system already that is quite largely private in that the government pays the bills, but we have private businesses. And you go to your doctor's office, if you're lucky to have one, and they've got a receptionist and staff, and they pay those people, and it's a business.
Right.
And I think a bit more honesty from the system about how that is already the case would be appropriate, because then we could look at having other services as long as they are provided at no cost on point of delivery to the patient.
Such as what? What other services? When the Premier says all options.
None of the services that we pay for now, people should have to pay for out of their pocket. But whether they are provided by someone sitting in one building or another building with one corporate name on it or another is of supreme disinterest to me, and I would guess to most New Brunswickers who just want to get care. And again, we have got a quite established now, enormous medical establishment, and I think we need to have a conversation about how that is going to have to be changed. And I hope Susan is right that just some honest conversations can make that work. My experience of dealing with entrenched power groups and structures anywhere in the world is that they are often more resistant to change than that. David had a good example with the birth of Medicare in Canada came about after an NDP premier caused a doctor's strike. And the doctors went on strike, and he brought in scab labor from the UK. He brought in scab doctors who worked for the, ironically, British Government Health Service. So these are huge changes often come with a level of complexity around them. And I do not think that we're going to escape some of that complexity with these changes.
Well, what we need are concrete actions laid out now for New Brunswickers to know that solutions are being implemented, that what they can expect happening this year, next budget year, the year after. So let's hear that primary health care centers, urgent care centers are being stood up in our cities to take the pressure off the ERs and provide access to health care for people who don't have doctors or nurse practitioners. Let's get those in place. Let's hear an announcement about that. Maybe it's coming.
Yeah.
Dominic, you might want to share with us now if it's true.
That's exactly it. It's like I said in my opening comments, people are anxious and scared,
Sure.
mainly because of a lack of, they feel like government isn't treating this issue with the urgency that they themselves feel. People are stressed and scared, and we are hearing nothing. You know, we went from daily COVID communications to a complete void of communications and transparency on this.
And that's the
we
void of
need to
leadership
hear
that you talked
what
about.
actions are being taken. Reassure me that you are taking this as seriously as my neighbor who is concerned about her husband and if he's going to have a next heart attack and if he's going to be able to get an ambulance and get care at a hospital. And so it's that lack of openness and transparency and that complete void of communication that is creating anxiety.
Is
in
that a
New Brunswickers.
communications issue or is that a policy issue?
Well, if there's something to communicate, we'd love to hear it. And in the absence of communication, we assume there's nothing being done because there's no actions being
People are
communicated.
just hearing crickets and they're wondering, well, what's going
Well,
on?
let's-
We've got a
What's
crisis
happening?
here
Let's
and
look at
what's
some-
going to happen?
There have been updates on what's going on in health. And the one thing which, and I can tell you, one thing just to reassure all of you guys as fellow New Brunswickers, people around the cabinet table and the people in the government are spending most time on the subject of all subjects because of the fact that it's affecting, none of us are different. I'm worried about my parents in their 80s in St. Andrews who have to decide if one of them has a health issue, are they going to go to St. Stephen and maybe it's not going to be open right then or not have the staff they need, or do they go to St. John, deal with the issues there? Everyone's facing these problems. And
I don't
but-
doubt that.
but
Hold
let-
on,
let-
let
let's-
him
let's
make,
finish.
finish the point, please.
That one of the things that I had tried really hard to do in this job is not to go out and just say things because there's a need for things to be said. Until we can actually get to grips with the complexity of this problem and actually offer some things that are real, the last thing that I want to put my backing into is pushing a health minister out to say things that are not going to turn into fact. We've had that over and over and over again. We have talked about here about how incredibly difficult the subject is, about how it touches on issues around administration, governance in the healthcare system, the way that our healthcare professions self-manage themselves and the degree of independence they have. These are not problems which you're going to be able to solve with a press release. Anything we can do in terms of, if you guys think there's more information of different types that can come out more regularly, let us know. But it is not going to be something where I do not see any virtue in saying we are going to do X right now if we don't know for sure that's the best thing to do and it's going to make a difference. So I'd rather be silent until we have something that's to say that's going to be constructive and helpful. And we haven't been silent. And I'll point on the COVID issue that yes, we stopped having the daily briefings at around the same point, if not after. Most places had stopped doing that. And we still do have the regular updates that come out that provide some basic information about the state of the disease that are entirely in line with other provinces in Canada.
Okay,
other places
let me
around
just
the world.
stop you there because I really did want to talk about public health and how New Brunswickers see the public health system. And I've got less than 10 minutes left, so I'm actually a little bit reluctant to go there, but I'm going to because I think it is part of the healthcare system. And so I'd like to ask you, how do you think public health handled itself during the pandemic?
I think that the collective response from New Brunswickers, including the government and all the different parts, including public health, from pretty much the first days through pretty much all the pandemic, because if you look now at this stage, and the pandemic certainly isn't over despite Joe Biden, him talking about the ways in which the U.S. had come through this, I went back and looked through all the different state and provincial results in terms of mortality and other things. New Brunswick came through incredibly well, both our economy and our population. So did well, but absolutely could always do things better. And one of the things that I'm really optimistic about with the report on the COVID response that's being worked on right now is that'll give us some concrete ideas that, God forbid this happens in the next few years, it'll happen again sooner rather than later. We'll be better armed next time.
Okay, Susan Holt, what do you think the public's perception is of how public health handled itself during the pandemic?
Well, I think there's probably two different answers to that because early on, I think the public was appreciative of public health's communication, of the direction that they were being given, the information that was being shared. We had dashboards, we had orange and green and red, and a sense of what was going to happen when and if, and there was lots of information being shared. And then at a point in time, that changed. We were
What
celebrating,
changed?
we were dancing. I think we had a blip in the results where we were between waves, and people thought, okay, it's better. We're gonna ease off on the communications and ease off on the measures. And since then, it's been silent, and I think that's created a lot of mistrust because we weren't hearing from public health, and it
Is that a
started
failing?
seeming like.
Is that a failing?
I think so. I really get concerned when I hear Dominic say things like, we're not going to communicate until we figure out if we have facts to communicate. It's like, how do you not know if you have facts to share or not? Like, what else would you
Susan,
be
you've been in government.
sharing?
You know that the tendency is often to share piece of information that might be reassuring to the public in the short term, but doesn't actually solve things in the long term. And every government has certainly been victim of that. This government less than any I've seen or been around.
I think that maybe this government underestimates the public's mistrust and need to have information about what are you planning to do, what did you do yesterday, what are the results you're striving for, because in the absence of communication, it creates fear and anxiety.
Okay.
And that's where New Brunswickers are sitting right
Government's
now.
commitment on healthcare. It came in those radical reforms at the highest level across the department. And also just on
But
COVID
a commitment on
specifically.
healthcare is not firing a CEO and eliminating elected officials on a health authority board. Like, that's not a commitment on healthcare.
That's just
Tell me
blowing
how
things
you're going to
up.
make access to healthcare better.
So would you preserve the current structure?
The current
the
structure
structure
of the
that was there.
people that were in the roles.
The structures that were there in terms of those, do you believe those governance structures are providing the healthcare in New Brunswick?
I think there's lots of ways to strengthen those
No, but so
without
you-
blowing them up and replacing
so
them
you
with
would have left
unelected trustees that aren't reporting to the public, that aren't accountable to anybody, and that we're getting less and less information. Public health is silent on this, and so
Okay.
there's no
Well,
sense
that's
of
not
why
public
was this
health's
being
job.
done, and how is changing the deck chairs on the Titanic and the folks going to change the result for the people who are trying to go to an ER to find that it's closed.
So status quo versus
Hang on one
change.
second. I want to come back to the. I want to give David Coon a chance to respond to that question. How do you think New Brunswickers perceive public health and what it did during the pandemic?
Well, I think public health was perceived very well in the darkest days of the pandemic. And that was when, in my estimation, the Premier was listening to public health. But, more recently, as well as a summer ago, it appeared to me the Premier stopped listening to public health. And so you got poor decisions made. And that's unfortunate. And it appeared to me that
Poor decisions by who?
it appeared to me that public health was during that period. When we say public health, I mean it's a group of people,
Right.
and we've got 6 medical officers of health and with a chief medical officer of health. But it seems as if the Premier got his way during that period of time, where he was really listening and implementing what public health was recommending before that. And I think people picked that up. There was a big change. And it was revealed when Dr. Muick, when she was Deputy Medical Officer of Health,
Krista Muick.
late August, a summer ago, said, we need to get back to masking because of the new variant that's here. It's very virulent and so on and so forth. It took a month for that to happen.
One of the things that I want to focus in the last couple of minutes we have, though, is the removal of the mask mandate in the schools, and the Chief Medical Officer of Health told New Brunswickers that the decision was made on the best scientific evidence, the available scientific evidence, and then it turned out that that wasn't the case. And I don't recall anybody in government, you or any of your cabinet colleagues, saying, hey, what the heck? You took the mask mandate out and you didn't base it on sound science?
Well, that's not quite what happened. There was a
Well,
request for information afterwards about what information they'd used, and they cited a study that was actually an interview. That was what happened.
Okay, so that's not really scientific.
But that was long after the decision to be made. So that wasn't the information that was used to base on that decision.
So who made the decision? Was it the Premier or was it the
No.
Chief
And
Medical
something
Officer?
I'm going to take
of
strong
Health?
exception to that David said, because he sat around the table at a lot of the COVID, nearly every single COVID committee meeting. And also correct something that Susan said, that the problem last summer, Delta was about to hit.
Right.
And at that point, there was about a couple of weeks when, is Delta going to hit or not? And the recommendation from public health, not the Premier, was that this is fine and we can continue to remove the measures. And that continued throughout the pandemic to this point. And I have never sat in a room where the advice of public health was not taken, ever.
Okay.
So, but it's important because it said that this is not being politicized except for the politicians that would follow the advice of public health. On something like the mask mandate in schools, I was pretty clear about being serious about COVID from a pretty early point in the pandemic and continue to be concerned about it and its long-term risks, and we see the issues with long COVID and so on. At the same time, when the doctors whose job it is to give us the advice on that subject come in and without any apparent political interference that I could see at all, and I certainly am not someone who just takes things at face value, I go and dig into them. I saw no evidence of that, and I was given answers to my questions. And at a certain point, regardless of my concerns as an individual with a layman's reading on the subject, I am not going to overwhelm experts, because one of the problems we have in governments around the world right now is people being populists and making decisions because it's easy to blame politicians and experts. And when we do that, we just risk, I think, fundamentals of our democracy more.
But because of that, there is a percentage of New Brunswickers, I'm not sure what the precise percentage is, but there is a percentage of New Brunswickers who have lost faith in the Department of Public Health and its ability to protect the public health of New Brunswick. And I think some of them think that political considerations overrode the public health considerations.
And that is, I think, the case throughout the
true or
pandemic.
not?
It is not true.
Maybe we need a fully independent public health office that reports to the legislature so that we could restore people's faith in the institution. Because having it buried and reporting to ADMs and others in the Department of Health means that people are scared for their job and their livelihood and don't speak as freely in that role. So I think we need to look at the independence of public health as a way to help restore New Brunswickers' faith in that group and to free them up to speak without concern of their personal job prospects.
And just on that note, Ed Schallenberg, the Registrar of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of New Brunswick, said regarding the mask mandate, in the end, and I'm quoting now, in the end, these decisions are made by politicians with whom the Chief Medical Officer of Health cannot openly disagree with. That sounds like that system's messed up.
Well, that gets into anyone providing advice to cabinet is providing it in confidence. And I hope I just gave a very, very clear answer to your question about was there political interference, and the answer is no.
Okay. Boy, what a great feeling to be back in the studio talking politics. I want to thank the three of you for your time. I think this has been a good discussion. And thank you for watching. And if you have any comments about what you've seen tonight or suggestions for future programs, please let us know. Go to the Rogers webpage and you can leave your comments there. Thanks a lot for watching.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you.
My pleasure.